One of the things I love to do at One Rental at a Time is talk to experts who have a much bigger purview of what is going on. And I think we need to talk about two things that I think might be cracking in a very interesting direction. One of them is vacancies, and one of them is perhaps the reinflation of rent. In order to have this conversation, we're going to talk with Dana from Hemlane. Dana, the CEO of Hemlane. How you doing, Dana?
I'm great. Thanks for having me again.
So Dana, remind the audience about the purview of Hemlane. How many units are kind of under the umbrella that you can pull data from? Because I think we need to talk about vacancies and possibly rent going back up.
Yeah, so from a data perspective, we have 22,000 rentals, where we know everything from, or maybe it's 23,000 now, but we know everything from are the tenants paying rent on time, to do they, and this is obviously nationwide, so certain geographies will have a higher concentration, to looking at renewal rates and how much those are increased. And so the reason all of that is so important to track and look at is really for our customers. This data is something that will help you to understand, hey, what are those trends? How much should I increase my rent by, et cetera? And so, yeah, we've looked at obviously vacancy trends. They're actually slightly above pre-pandemic rates. So they're around, 6.8% right now. Of
Okay.
course, that's where that is where we're going into the summer season. So you're going to see slightly more turnover there. But the question is, what do you do with vacancies? How do you think about rent? And how do you think about reducing vacancy? Because the most costly expense is a bad tenant. The second most costly expense is vacancy.
Yeah, turnover. Yeah, that's where it gets a lot of folks. I'd be curious about the 6.8%. And if you don't have the data, it's okay. Maybe for next week. Have you noticed a difference between single family homes in units, or you maybe not have that data ready today?
That data I know at a high level that obviously if it's a multifamily is about 50%, just so you know, it's like 47% of our portfolio single family and the
Okay.
rest is multifamily. So it is very concentrated on single family, which makes it where the numbers from that perspective, I can actually compare kind of apples to apples. But on the vacancy side, it's always much higher with apartments. It
Yeah.
always is. And you can understand why. There's whether it's a more short-term situation because it's not a
Mhm.
family who doesn't want to move schools,
Yeah.
or another reason for it is neighborhood, or with your neighbors, they're too loud, something like that. You want to get out of the place. You just see higher turnover in multifamily than you see in single family.
Yeah.
So from the single family side, it's definitely lower.
Yeah, so let's talk about it because I think that's important for folks. Some of the people watching this own units, whether that's 2, 4, or bigger, and some own single family, because I think the answers are different, right? In my opinion. So if you want to talk about single family first, we can go there. When I look at my portfolio, it's the same thing, right? My average tenure in a home was just about 8 years. It's less than 2 years in apartment. So my data is very similar to what you're seeing in Hemlane. So that's good. But when I look at single family homes, there's a couple of things that I see when we have a vacancy. One is they're buying a home. That's a great thing. Second is some kind of family dynamic has changed, either marriage, either separation, right? Divorce, breaking up, or getting together, right? There's just more people. Again, those are life events. That's not really something the landlord like I could take on.
Yep.
What I would tell you as far as the landlord goes, you've got to just communicate. You got to take care of the property, fix the things that are there. Um, Really, for single family homes, in my experience, it's some outside event because that's usually the goal for tenants is to get into a home. And unless there's some kind of extraordinary life event, which, I, congratulations on buying a home. It's awesome. It's tough, at least in single family homes. What do you see?
Yeah. So I think from that perspective, how we look at that is controllable versus uncontrollable,
There you
right?
go.
Um,
Hmm.
so that's where we segment it out. Those who use Hemlane, and I don't have the data behind those who don't use Hemlane, but I would hope that the controllable is down, significantly down. And then it's interesting because on the uncontrollable vacancy, which is a life event, something like that, what we're seeing is not as many moving out due to purchasing, which you can imagine with interest rates where they are, people holding on. So we haven't seen as much for that. It's usually something else, like they're getting married, they need a bigger space. They're getting a divorce, they need a smaller space, something like that. And yeah, when we look at it, I mean, it is one of those things that you as a landlord should also be tracking. You should be asking the tenant, hey, why are you moving out? Select a reason. Is the rent too high, this or that? And by capturing that information, you yourself will be able to much better understand your customer, who is the tenant, and help in the future. Because, you know, as you build your portfolio from 1 to 10 to 20, suddenly it does become a material difference. If you see every single tenant is saying they're moving out because the rent increase was too high, then you have to say, what are my sources for that? What am I doing? How do I incentivize them to stay? But if it's in that, you know, uncontrollable, potentially not much you can do there. So that's kind of how I think about the data, and how I also think that you as a real estate investor should think about the data.
Yeah. So if we were to flip over to units now, there's a lot more controllable, to use your world there. When I think about single family homes, my job is really to take care of the inside when something breaks, to communicate with the tenant, all of that. But when you're looking at units, there's so much potentially going on the outside of the property: parking, noise complaints,
Yeah.
landscaping, I mean, garbage. I mean, it could be lots park. It's just, there's all of these things. So one of the things that I challenge landlords who have units is to watch kind of the outside of the property, communicate, drive by, because it could be the littlest thing that causes a tenant to go. Because again, it's a smaller unit, it's easier to move. There are more of them. And if you can really do a good job of managing the outside, you can limit turnover, but you will still have more there than a house. But there's a lot of stuff that happens outside of
Yeah.
the units that could trigger a reason to move. So watch out for those things.
Yeah, and you know, some of the things that happen outside, like the parking and stuff like that, there may be a situation, or like we had one recently in Boise where it was like the train always goes by it. And it's really loud. And so that might be a sign that also that you want to 1031 it, and that
Yeah.
may and find some other property. So all that data will help you make your decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, let's talk about rent on this, because again, I think we the data exiting Q4, maybe entering Q1, as people were seeing rents softening. We have Fed President Waller, I think Christopher Waller, warning yesterday that he fears rent inflation, right? With the housing market kind of turning around, that rent inflation may restart. I don't know if you have any really current data, but I think it's rent we have to watch. But the reason we have to watch rent is because that's part of inflation. And if that
Mhm.
reverses, we may need to go higher for longer in interest rates. It's kind of all feeds on itself. So what are you seeing with rent?
Yeah, from a rent perspective, it's really interesting because it's so heavily dependent on the market. And so we have seen some markets, and we have not seen, by the way, what we saw, I think it was like a year and a half, 2 years ago, where rents were just like, you know, people were like
Ooh.
10% renewal rate, like 10% increase on your rent on renewals. We're not seeing that. We're definitely not. But what we are seeing is that in some markets, you can still give a, you know, usually if you think about renewal rates are the best way to do it. When you look at the renewal rates and what would take a tenant to stay versus going to another property, we used to, you know, on average, you kind of see those around a 3% marker. And there's certain markets where we're seeing that much higher. And what's interesting about that is it's actually typically not cities, it's right outside cities.
Oh, okay.
And here's the more interesting part about it. There is this like, hey, go back to work, remote work is over type storyline that you're hearing from the media. But on our side, what's interesting is we're not quite seeing that play a role. People are still saying, like, yeah, I have to go back, but it's only 2 to 3 days of the week. So a slightly higher commute is better. And then it's also been heavily dependent on certain markets. So, like, where I'm in California and San Francisco, we don't see it as much as like in Florida and some places in like Georgia and the Southeast and stuff. We are seeing that there's still that increase, and there was a huge increase, a year and a half ago, but we're still seeing that people can demand those rates, but it's heavily dependent on each market. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that might be interesting for next week, if you ask your team to look at, is I'd be really curious about the Southeast, right?
Yeah.
Georgia, Florida, because I actually think those markets have been so hot for so long, they've got to come back. We're seeing insurance rates go through the roof, especially on the coasts. It just feels like Florida in general needs to take a breath. It would be really interesting to see what's
Yeah.
going on kind of in the Florida, Georgia information. But folks, we do have to watch rent inflation because, again, as I talk about, inflation has three components. There's the goods, the stuff that shows up in cardboard boxes. There is housing, which right now appears to be rolling over, but we have to watch it. And of course, services, AKA wages, the really, really hard stuff. But if somebody wanted to get access to Hemlane's trial, Dana, where would they go?
Yeah, you can go to www.hemlane.com. And even if you're just looking for a rent estimate on your property, feel free to go there and we can give you one.
Now, folks, and again, if you don't have any rental units, I strongly suggest practicing using the 15-day trial just for fun, really having an understanding of what it is to be a landlord. And if you have a couple of units, test it out, see what's what. I think you could see, again, if it's good enough for Dion, the lazy landlord, it's probably good enough for most of us. So, Dana, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.